The filing hit the docket. The political world didn't just pause, it leaned in, because whenever a legal document even hints at the private world of power, especially one involving Donald Trump and Melania Trump, speculation moves faster than facts, headlines ignite before context settles, and suddenly a routine procedural submission is framed as something explosive, something intimate, something that promises to pull back the curtain on a marriage that has long existed at the intersection of politics, performance, loyalty, and image. Within minutes, commentators were calling it a bombshell, analysts were dissecting phrasing line by line, and audiences everywhere were asking the same question: what does this filing really reveal, and what does it only appear to reveal? Because here's the reality that often gets lost in the rush. Legal filings are rarely written for drama, yet they become dramatic when the names attached carry decades of history, controversy, branding, and public mythology. And in this case, the intrigue wasn't just about legal language, it was about the subtle undertones, the structural framing, the choice of emphasis that observers interpreted as clues about dynamics inside a marriage that has been photographed endlessly, yet understood only partially. The tension didn't come from accusation alone, but from the suggestion that behind the polished appearances and choreographed public moments, there might be a more complex negotiation of partnership, distance, strategy, and survival. For years, their relationship has been analyzed not only as a marriage, but as a symbol, sometimes of loyalty under pressure, sometimes of calculated independence, sometimes of silent endurance. And every public gesture, whether a glance on a debate stage or a carefully worded statement, has been magnified into meaning. So when this filing surfaced, it didn't exist in isolation. It landed on top of a narrative already layered with assumptions, political divides, and media fascination, which meant that even neutral language could be interpreted as revealing tension, revealing alignment, or revealing something far more strategic than emotional. What made this moment particularly gripping was not that it confirmed a scandal in clear terms, but that it opened interpretive space. And interpretive space is where modern media thrives, because ambiguity invites projection, and projection fuels engagement. Commentators began asking whether the filing hinted at protective boundaries, whether it demonstrated unity in the face of scrutiny, or whether it exposed the inevitable strain that comes when personal relationships operate under relentless public examination. And suddenly, what might have been a technical detail became a psychological Rorschach test for supporters and critics alike. Behind the scenes, one can imagine the instinctive calculations that accompany any high-profile legal step: the weighing of privacy against transparency, the strategic choice of wording, the anticipation of how a single paragraph might be reframed in a headline. And in a marriage already lived beneath a global microscope, those calculations are not merely legal, but reputational, not merely procedural, but deeply personal, because every document becomes part of the historical record, and every record becomes part of the narrative architecture that defines how a couple is remembered. It's important to separate verified content from amplified interpretation, yet the speed of modern discourse rarely allows that luxury. And so the filing became less about what was explicitly stated and more about what observers believed it implied. Was it a sign of coordinated strategy? A reflection of private boundaries being asserted? A reinforcement of partnership under pressure? The answers depended largely on the lens through which one was already viewing the couple, and that is precisely why the reaction was so polarized, because the story of their marriage has always functioned as a canvas onto which broader political and cultural debates are projected. And perhaps that is the real secret hinted at by this so-called bombshell, not a hidden confession buried in legal jargon, but the reminder that in high-stakes public life, marriage itself becomes a performance space where loyalty, autonomy, image management, and emotional reality intersect in ways few outsiders can fully decode, leaving audiences simultaneously fascinated and uncertain, compelled to read between the lines, compelled to interpret tone and timing as revelation, and compelled, above all, to keep watching, keep debating, and keep asking what is strategy, what is symbolism, and what is simply the private complexity of two individuals navigating extraordinary scrutiny together. What transformed this filing from a procedural update into a cultural flashpoint was not simply its content, but its timing, because timing in politics is rarely accidental and almost never irrelevant. The document surfaced at a moment when scrutiny around power, loyalty, and personal alliances was already heightened, and that context amplified every clause into something that felt strategic, intentional, almost theatrical, as if the legal language itself carried subtext about stability, distance, protection, or unity, and observers immediately began mapping those interpretations onto years of public appearances, speeches, and carefully choreographed moments that have defined how the marriage of Donald Trump and Melania Trump is perceived. The fascination, however, runs deeper than gossip or curiosity, because at its core, this story touches on a fundamental tension in public life. How much of a marriage belongs to the public when one partner occupies the highest levels of political power, and how much remains fiercely private regardless of scrutiny? In that gray space, legal filings become symbolic artifacts, documents that may address specific legal questions yet are read as emotional statements, declarations of solidarity, or signs of internal recalibration. And it is precisely that interpretive elasticity that fueled the Bombshell framing. Consider the psychology of high-profile partnerships under relentless observation. Every gesture can be reframed as meaningful, every absence as telling, every carefully measured statement as either supportive or detached, depending on the viewer's prior belief. In that environment, even silence becomes commentary. And so when a filing appears to clarify roles, assets, boundaries, or legal positioning, the public does not see paperwork. It sees potential insight into loyalty structures, trust negotiations, and the unseen conversations that happen behind closed doors when two individuals must navigate not only marriage, but global attention. Analysts began dissecting language with almost forensic intensity, noting the structure of the arguments, the placement of key phrases, the emphasis on certain protections or clarifications, asking whether the tone suggested defensive posture or strategic alignment, and this analytical frenzy revealed as much about modern media culture as it did about the marriage itself, because in a digital ecosystem driven by engagement, ambiguity becomes currency, and the suggestion of a secret, even if unproven, travels faster and further than a measured explanation of legal routine. Yet there is another layer often overlooked. Marriages in high-power environments frequently operate on principles unfamiliar to ordinary public imagination, where discretion, compartmentalization, and long-term strategy can coexist with genuine partnership. What looks distant in a photograph might reflect calculated composure, what appears silent in a headline might be deliberate non-participation, and what reads as revelation in a filing might simply be prudent legal housekeeping. But when the individuals involved are among the most recognized figures in modern politics, neutrality rarely survives contact with narrative momentum. Behind closed doors, one can reasonably infer that conversations about privacy, reputation, and legal exposure are not abstract, but intensely practical, shaped by years of experience under scrutiny. And if anything, this filing underscores how deeply intertwined personal and political realities become at that level of visibility. Instinctively, both partners would understand that every line written will be parsed, every implication magnified. And so the decision to file, the wording chosen, and the scope defined likely reflect careful deliberation, not only about legal necessity, but about perception management in an era where perception can rival policy in influence. Ultimately, what makes this chapter compelling is not proof of scandal, but the enduring mystery of how a marriage functions when lived on a global stage, where loyalty can be both personal and political, where distance can be either emotional or strategic, and where a single document can ignite weeks of debate. The so-called secret may not be a hidden truth waiting to explode, but rather the sophisticated balancing act required to sustain a partnership under extraordinary pressure, and that realization invites a deeper question for viewers. Are we witnessing exposure, or are we witnessing the complex choreography of two public figures navigating survival in a world that rarely distinguishes between intimacy and image? By the time the media cycle reached full velocity, the filing itself had almost faded into the background, replaced by layered commentary, reaction panels, and speculative analysis that turned a structured legal document into a living narrative about power, loyalty, and image control. And what became striking was not just how quickly the story spread, but how differently it was interpreted depending on political alignment. Because in modern discourse, facts often serve as raw material, while perception becomes the finished product. And the marriage of Donald Trump and Melania Trump once again found itself positioned as symbolic terrain in a broader cultural debate. Supporters framed the development as further evidence of strategic unity, suggesting that any legal clarification reflected prudence and foresight rather than fracture, emphasizing resilience under pressure and portraying the filing as a reminder that high-profile families must take extraordinary steps to safeguard privacy and interests, while critics interpreted the same text as revealing strain, distance, or recalibration, arguing that legal boundaries imply emotional or structural complexity. And this divergence demonstrated how a single document can function as a mirror, reflecting not objective truth, but pre-existing belief. The instinctive human tendency to search for hidden meaning intensified the scrutiny, with commentators replaying past public moments, a delayed handhold, a reserved expression, a carefully neutral statement, as if those fragments might now form a cohesive pattern. And in doing so, they constructed narratives that felt coherent, even if they were built from selective evidence, because storytelling thrives on connecting dots. And once the idea of a secret enters the conversation, every prior detail is retroactively reassessed through that lens. Yet the reality of long-term partnerships under extreme public visibility is rarely reducible to symbolic gestures, and analysts who approach the situation with more caution pointed out that legal filings often serve narrow technical purposes, drafted with precision to address defined issues rather than to signal emotional dynamics, and that projecting relational meaning onto procedural language risks oversimplifying a partnership that has evolved across decades, business ventures, political campaigns, and unprecedented scrutiny. Until the cultural appetite for behind-the-scenes revelation proved stronger than procedural nuance, and as headlines escalated, phrases like bombshell and exposed gained traction, reinforcing the impression that something hidden had finally surfaced, even if the actual text offered more structure than sensation. This amplification cycle highlights a central paradox of modern political storytelling. The quieter the document, the louder the interpretation, and the more restrained the language, the more room there is for imagination to expand. In high-stakes environments, perception can influence tangible outcomes, shaping public trust, electoral calculations, and media framing. And therefore, even the suggestion of marital recalibration carries weight beyond the personal, because voters and observers often evaluate leadership through lenses of stability, loyalty, and character, meaning that narratives about private relationships can ripple outward into broader judgments about governance and credibility, whether or not those narratives are grounded in concrete evidence. What emerges from this phase of the story is less a confirmed secret and more a study in how narratives are built, reinforced, and contested in real time, revealing as much about audience psychology and media economics as about the couple at the center. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of all is how quickly complex human dynamics are compressed into simplified headlines, reminding us that while legal documents may outline obligations and protections, the true complexity of any marriage, especially one lived in the glare of global attention, remains layered, negotiated, and largely invisible to those determined to decode it from a distance. As the narrative intensified, another dimension began to surface, not in the filing itself, but in the silence that followed it. Because in high-profile marriages, especially those entangled with political power, silence is rarely accidental. It can be shield, signal, or strategy, and in this case, the absence of dramatic public rebuttal or emotional display only deepened the intrigue, prompting observers to ask whether restraint reflected confidence, containment, or a deliberate refusal to feed a cycle that thrives on escalation. Image management at this level is not improvisational. It is structured, often meticulously calibrated, shaped by years of understanding how quickly a narrative can spiral, and when a filing becomes framed as a bombshell, the instinct may not be to amplify or deny, but to allow the document to stand on its technical merit, avoiding language that could inadvertently validate speculative framing. And that choice, to engage minimally, can itself be interpreted as unity, detachment, or disciplined message control, depending on who is doing the interpreting. There is also the matter of autonomy within partnership, a concept often oversimplified in public discourse. Melania Trump has historically maintained a distinct public rhythm, appearing selectively, speaking deliberately, and preserving a measure of separation between political turbulence and personal presentation. And that pattern complicates simplistic readings of any legal development, because independence within marriage does not inherently signal fracture. It can signal negotiated boundaries that both protect identity and stabilize partnership under strain. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's public persona has long been characterized by directness and counterpunching, yet even in moments of heightened scrutiny, strategic restraint can emerge when escalation offers little advantage, and the interplay between assertive defense and calculated quiet becomes part of the choreography that observers attempt to decode, searching for cracks or confirmations in tonal shifts, even when those shifts may be less about emotion and more about legal prudence. Behind closed doors, the stakes of perception likely weigh heavily, because when public narratives question relational stability, the implications extend beyond gossip into assessments of strength, loyalty, and focus. And in political environments, perception can influence not only media framing, but donor confidence, ally alignment, and voter psychology, which means that even a technical clarification in a filing must be considered within a broader ecosystem of influence where personal and political capital intersect. It is also worth acknowledging that long marriages evolve through phases invisible to outsiders, adapting to changing careers, public roles, and external pressures, and what appears from a distance as tension may, from within, be routine negotiation of privacy, responsibility, and exposure. The filing, when stripped of sensational framing, may simply represent another adaptation in a relationship that has navigated business empires, campaign trails, and international scrutiny. Circumstances few couples ever confront simultaneously. Ultimately, Part 4 reveals that the so-called secret may not lie in hidden scandal, but in the sophisticated balancing act required to sustain partnership amid relentless visibility, where silence communicates as powerfully as speech, where boundaries can coexist with loyalty, and where legal documentation becomes one thread in a much larger tapestry of image, instinct, and survival. The true drama may be less about revelation and more about endurance, less about exposure and more about the discipline required to let ambiguity breathe while the world insists on certainty. By now, the filing was no longer just a document. It had become a storyline, a symbol, almost a referendum on how modern audiences interpret marriage when it intersects with power. And what makes this phase particularly revealing is not what the paperwork says, but how quickly collective memory begins rewriting itself around a single headline. Because once the phrase "secret exposed" enters circulation, it reshapes past moments, recasts neutral interactions as clues, and reframes ordinary legal safeguards as dramatic turning points in a relationship that has always existed under extraordinary scrutiny. Public memory is fluid, and in politically charged environments, it is often selective, meaning that a single development can retroactively color years of imagery, campaign stages, state dinners, airport arrivals, transforming routine snapshots into symbolic evidence. Viewers begin asking whether composure signaled distance, whether independence signaled tension, whether privacy signaled strategy, and in that interpretive process, the marriage becomes less a live partnership and more a narrative construct molded by cultural expectations about loyalty, affection, strength, and autonomy. What this reveals about our media ecosystem is profound. We are drawn not only to power, but to the human dynamics surrounding power. Because leadership feels more comprehensible when filtered through relational lenses. And so stories about marriages, friendships, and alliances often carry disproportionate weight, functioning as shorthand for character assessment. When observers debate the state of Donald Trump and Melania Trump's relationship, they are often debating broader questions about resilience, authenticity, and stability, even if those larger questions remain implicit. There is also an undercurrent of projection at play, where audiences unconsciously map their own experiences and expectations onto high-profile couples, assuming that visible behavior must align with familiar emotional scripts. Yet relationships forged and sustained in environments of wealth, politics, and global visibility operate under pressures that differ dramatically from ordinary life, and legal clarifications in such contexts may reflect logistical complexity rather than emotional rupture, strategic foresight rather than hidden fracture. The amplification cycle, however, rewards the most dramatic interpretation because drama generates clicks, discussion, and extended engagement, and thus the bombshell framing persists even when details remain measured. In this cycle, nuance competes with narrative momentum, and while experts may caution against overreach, the broader conversation often gravitates toward the interpretation that feels most consequential, most revealing, most definitive, even when definitive conclusions remain elusive. Yet beneath the speculation lies a quieter truth. Endurance in high-visibility marriages often depends on negotiated boundaries that outsiders rarely understand. Boundaries about privacy, role definition, and public participation that may shift over time without signaling collapse. Longevity itself suggests adaptive capacity, and adaptation in such environments requires discipline, trust in private communication channels, and an awareness that not every public inference deserves public correction. As Part 5 unfolds, what becomes clear is that the so-called exposure may reveal less about hidden secrets and more about how narratives crystallize around powerful figures, reminding us that perception can harden into assumed truth long before evidence confirms it, and that in the realm of political storytelling, marriages become mirrors reflecting cultural anxieties about loyalty, independence, and control. Mirrors that captivate us precisely because they blur the line between documented fact and interpretive imagination.